have done this series at Tabernacle Baptist, my home church, before, and I thought, what if we revisit some of our favorite, most beloved childhood stories of the Bible? We often, think of these stories as children's stories. We think we know what they say, and then we go back and read them as adults, and we're like, oh no, I didn't realize this is what this really said. Or maybe it's a little bit more nuanced than we thought it was. So he thought this was fun. We brainstormed and decided that maybe the most beloved children's story from the Bible is Noah's Ark. And so we decided that would be today's topic. Sure enough, I was driving over here this morning and it started raining. I thought, oh no. If you ever doubt that God has a sense of humor. So, the thought is we're going to read some big chunks of text this morning as we re-encounter this story of Noah and the great flood. So many of us encountered this for the first time as children. I read my children. We have like 3 or 4 children's Bibles, and this is one of the more prominent stories in it. And I find myself having to awkwardly navigate the story as I read it to them. Basically, everyone in the world dies, and I don't necessarily like sharing that with my children. What does that suggest about who God is? What does that suggest about humanity and why God would do this? And we were talking a little bit just now before class, Stuart and I. You feel like as children get older, you almost have to reteach the story because they learned one version of it as children and another version as adults. So we're going to wade through, see what we may have missed when we encountered this as children, and maybe what new is in the story. But I did want to ask first, and maybe briefly, by way of an icebreaker, I'm thinking about what we're going to do in March. I'm wondering if y'all can think of particular stories that you all loved as children from the Bible, or particular stories that y'all think of as children's Bible stories that are your favorites. I'll make a list if you will name some, and then I'll pick one for our spring topic. Jonah. Oh yeah, that's a great one. Absolutely. Jonah and the whale.
Abraham and Sarah having a baby at an old age.
Yes, Abraham and Sarah having a baby. We usually leave out the Hagar and Ishmael part. Teaching that, it's really awkward to try to explain to kids. But that's a great one. Yeah, what else? Moses. Okay, baby Moses?
Yeah,
or
baby Moses in the bulrushes.
Baby Moses. Oh, not so sweet. And Pharaoh is off slaughtering babies.
Right.
Yes. What else?
Zacchaeus.
Oh, that's a good one. That was on my radar too. Zacchaeus. A wee little man. Yeah. Anything else?
Well,
Yeah.
the most basic of all, Adam and Eve.
Oh, Adam and Eve. That's a good story. Yeah, Adam
Don't have
and
anything
Eve.
else.
That's right. It
Yeah,
starts. Yeah, it starts there. Anything else?
Daniel in the lion's den.
Oh yeah, the lion's den.
Cuddling
Lion's
Colin.
den. Yeah, and I also think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the fiery furnace. When I think of children's stories, these are people that remained faithful to God, and God protected them in their hour of need. So those are good.
Lest we forget David and Goliath.
That is sort of like the consummate, childhood story. David and Goliath, right? Goliath. Also involves gruesome death.
They all have a gruesome part.
Yeah. When you start to think about it, you think, I wonder why we read the Bible at all to children. I do, but I wrestle with it at times. Well, thanks for helping me build that list. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of background on this story and in Genesis. Do y'all have Bibles, by the way?
Yeah.
Or not?
Yes.
Sometimes people just have them on their phones now. It's back in the olden day, they would open up the Torah scroll and literally have to scroll to their place in Scripture. And now I say in Sunday school, all right, if you'll scroll to Genesis, and people start to discover we don't necessarily need everyone to have one, but if a few folks that are maybe willing to read a little bit for us, that'd be great. So here's what we're looking at. This is what we're looking at when we're talking about the story of Noah and the great flood. We're in Genesis 6. It's really a pretty big story. Genesis gives a lot of space to the story of Noah and the flood. And this is in the section of Genesis called the primeval history. Does that term sound familiar at all? I don't know that we say it a lot in churches. It's really the first 11 chapters of Genesis. It covers the creation story, this sort of like introduction of sin, the first murder. Tower of Babel is in there, and then the story of Noah and the great flood takes up a big space in it. When I think primeval history, I think like earliest history, or maybe even history before history or stories before history. When I think of this early part of Genesis, and this is my opinion, and it's shared by a lot of other people, what we are reading is not so much history, but myth, okay? And when I say myth, I don't necessarily mean these are false stories, but they are not necessarily historical in the sense that we think of history, right? The author of Genesis is not writing history for the sake of history, but they're trying to write meaningful stories about who God is and what it means to be human in this world. And so usually when scholars speak of myth, what they mean are stories that are in many senses profoundly true because they speak deeply to what it means to be human, what it says about who we think God is, and our relationship with this divine figure. All right?
I remember reading one time or seeing on the news that scholars and historians were truly looking for the ark.
That pops up. In fact, I've seen it in my Facebook feed recently, like Ark discovered on, I can't remember
Mount
where it
Ararat.
was.
Ararat.
Yeah, somewhere in Turkey or something, right? Yeah. I did a little bit of digging. I'm a skeptic by nature. As best as I can tell, the general consensus, and I wrote this down, and I was thinking about archaeology and history. The general consensus among credible historians is that there's no legitimate archaeological evidence for a historical Noah's Ark. Okay, of course people want to find it if it was, historically true, as described by Genesis. When I read this story, I don't necessarily feel a strong need to read it as history. I think it says profound things about our understanding of humanity and God, even without having to say, oh, this definitely happened the way that Genesis described. But it is sure interesting. Every once in a while you'll see, of course, unless you can go climb the mountain yourself, it's going to be hard to prove, I think. All right. I think it would probably make front page news if they really, really discovered it. I would expect to see that on the New York Times. So some scholars have certainly suggested that the story of the Great Flood is rooted in primitive stories of localized flooding in the Mesopotamian region. If you think of, are you?
Yes, I just have a question.
Oh, sure.
Because, well, it's kind of troubling to me that you would say that Noah's Ark and, you're skeptical of anybody ever finding it.
Sure.
Yet, as a scientist, when you look at the dimensions he describes building an ark, it comes out to be a very, very stable platform. So part of science says, okay, if this is what you built, it would have been very, very stable in order to survive a catastrophe like that.
Yeah.
So you're like, in one way you're telling me, no, don't believe what you read here, but in another way I'm saying, but everything I look at scientifically says that's a very, very good design.
Sure.
How do you kind of...
I was actually going to show you the dimensions of it, and certainly folks have made arguments for this is how you would fit all of the creatures in the ark, and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is not that you shouldn't believe everything that you read, but as a biblical scholar, I would say the author of Genesis is not writing this as pure history, but theology. Maybe that's the best way to say it. If they discovered Noah's Ark, I would be the first one there to check it out. I would be amazed. But what many scholars have discovered is that there are lots of flood stories in antiquity. There's ancient Mesopotamian and Babylonian flood stories. Some scholars think that, if you think about the Tigris and the Euphrates River, they're like Fertile Crescent. Those rivers would flood regularly, and that was a significant concern for people. So there's some flood anxiety, and of course flooding back then would have been associated with divine blessing or divine punishment. If you've heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh, does this sound familiar? Yeah, this is an ancient Babylonian story. The oldest copy that we have is something like 4,000 years old. So it even predates the biblical literature. This is a story of a great flood. Someone builds an ark. The Babylonian gods choose someone to sort of like, you will survive this ark. And so there's certainly connections between the Genesis account and other stories of a great flood in antiquity. It may be that they knew of each other, or there was some sort of like intercultural story sharing. Genesis was probably finalized around the Babylonian exile, 6th century BC or so. So in some senses, it's younger than this account of the Babylonian flood. All right. Oh, and I did mention that up there. So let me put you on the spot, and this is going to be a little bit of a test. What do you remember about Noah's Ark from childhood?
2 by 2.
2 by 2, perfect. Okay, good. Check. What details of the story stand out to you?
Well, the God was angry,
God was angry.
and he decided to eliminate everybody from the earth, but then at the last minute, he decides no, and will perpetuate mankind.
Yes, yeah, and for some reason, and we'll see in the text, it's not especially clear. It just says Noah was a righteous man, but God chooses Noah's family. That's right. Yeah.
How long is a cubit?
A cubit? Isn't it this? Yeah, it describes it in cubits, right?
He said the dove at the end. The dove at the end.
Yeah, that's right. There's a dove.
And a raven.
And a rainbow. Yeah.
Raven.
Oh, and a raven. That's right. A dove and a raven. Yeah, we'll see that.
He had 3 sons.
There's 3 sons. Yeah.
And the rainbow, who's that one?
Yeah, there's a rainbow. Yeah.
That was the sign that he would never flood again.
That's right. Yeah. Do you remember the people that that mocked Noah and say, why are you doing this? And then Noah sort of stays the course and trusts God. Do you? Okay. All right, that was a trick question. That's actually not in there.
Not in there.
Oh.
Made up.
That's Hollywood, yeah. And I have looked at, so this is one of the reasons that revisiting these stories has interested me. That's often in children's versions. They will say that. And the people said, Noah, why are you building this ark? You're crazy. And Noah said, God told me to, I'm going to do it anyway. It's not actually in Scripture. And I think part of the impulse there is they're trying to make it into a lesson that we can teach kids. If God tells you to do something, stick to it, right? So it sort of makes the story palatable to children. Sorry for tricking you like that. It's not in there. It's so interesting. Do you remember what the moral of the story was when you think about Noah's Ark? Was there some sort of like easily packaged moral for kids? And that's the one I remember, I will say, is if God tells you something, listen to God. Anybody remember sort of like a moral?
Moral, you can push him too far and there'll dire consequences.
Okay, you can push God too far and suffer the consequences. All right, yeah.
All God's creatures can be together in something so small.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, I'm like, why didn't they just maul each other?
Yeah.
But
That is
the story kind of prevailed.
Yeah, that would be an interesting zoological experiment. How do we put all these animals in here and then they actually survive? Yeah. All right. Let's see. And maybe just one last question. Is this a story that you regularly encounter in church, or do you sense that we mostly reserve it for children? I'm just curious. Okay, yeah. It's so rare that it comes up in our, worship or lectionary texts. So let's actually jump in and read it. I'm going to let one of you do some reading, if you will. We're going to read the first 6 verses, Genesis 6, verses 5 through 10. And let's take a quick look at this. If someone will read that for us.
I've got that. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
You want to do two more verses?
These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I always tell my students, if you come across a word that you don't know how to pronounce in scripture, just go for it. Sound confident, no one will be the wiser. All right, well, let me point out a couple things, and I'm curious to see if anything stands out to you as well. Notice, this is curious. Verse 5, the Lord, verse 5, saw that the wickedness of humankind was great. And then verse 9, Noah walked with God. These are 2 different names or 2 different ways of describing God. Lord in all caps suggests that this is the sacred name of God in Hebrew. In Hebrew, Yod, He, Vav, He. Sometimes you'll pronounce it Yahweh, but early Jewish people would try to avoid saying the sacred name of God. I think that the Jewish people today still try to avoid this. So they would say Adonai when they came across the sacred name, and in English we get Lord in all caps. But notice then, verse 9, Noah walked with God. The word here is Elohim. All right? I want to point this out to you up front because I think it's going to be helpful as we read a little bit further in this story. There are actually two early Jewish accounts of the Great Flood that have been preserved. Scholars have detected 2 sources, and we see that in these different names for God, and you'll notice as we read through, they keep bouncing back between these 2 names as if whoever wrote Genesis down and put pen to paper wove these stories together, okay? We're going to see some things that contradict one another a little bit, and this helps explain that there are 2 stories that the author has woven together.
Would you mind explaining again who do you think put Genesis together?
So yeah, I would say
Who are the historians?
most people think that Genesis in the form that we have was probably produced around the 6th century BC, so much later than the events that it reports, around the time of the Babylonian exile. Now these stories would have been floating around in Jewish culture and in religious circles for much longer than that, but finally someone had to put pen to paper, right? And what they have is they have what scholars have called the J source or the Yahwist source, and then the P source, the priestly source, and whoever is putting pen to paper is stitching them together for this account of Noah's Ark and the Great Flood. So we're going to see a couple other things that's going to flag this for us as we go a little bit deeper, but I wanted to tip my hat to it, right here at the beginning. Hang on to this verse 5, we're going to come back to it. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. Right? Alright. Alright. And any indication, verse 8, I'm a little bit curious by this, but Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Do we know why God selected Noah? It's a little bit thin on the data, I would say, right?
He liked animals.
What's that?
He liked animals.
He was a zoologist, yeah. Yeah.
He was righteous.
The problem with verse 6, the Lord was angry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him in his heart. God is omniscient. How did he not know that they were going to react the way they reacted?
Yeah.
And how does he feel? Repentance is what this sorry means.
Uh-huh,
How
okay.
can God be repentant when he's God?
This story does raise really good questions about God, right?
Right.
Why would God create the world and create people with a capacity for violence and not see this coming, right? And what, I don't want to spoil the ending. I'm not sure we're going to get a good answer for that question. One of the things I think this text does is raise good questions. Why do people commit violence in the world? It doesn't give us answers, but it does invite us to wrestle with them. And I think sometimes in wrestling with those questions, we are on the path to wisdom, if that makes sense. It's not going to spoon feed us answers, but it is going to raise good questions. So, yeah.
When does Holy Spirit start to evolve in this text? I mean, over time. I know it's, I don't want to take a tangent on you.
Sure, yeah. So we see the Spirit of God moving over the face of the waters in Genesis 1, right? And we're actually going to see it in just a little bit here, too. So maybe hold on to that thought. Of course, it's fully developed in Christian circles come New Testament era, but certainly we see discussion of God's Spirit here in early Genesis, too. Let's keep reading for the sake of time. Great questions, great comments. We do have to read some big chunks here, so I hope that this will be bearable. Let's read the rest of Genesis chapter 6, if someone will pick up at verse 11. Read it nice and loud for us.
And now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark is 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark, and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark on its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds. Of every creeping thing on the ground according to its kind, 2 of every kind shall come to you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this, and all that God commanded him.
right, thank you. So Noah has Noah's marching orders, God has God's marching orders. Verse 17, God says, for my part, this is what I'm gonna do. And basically for your part, Noah, here's what you're gonna do. There's certainly a strong sense that God and Noah are in a real, genuine partnership here, right? They're collaborating on this effort, on the one hand to destroy humanity, but on the other hand to save a remnant of humanity, right? Verse 11 is maybe a little bit more specific than verse 5. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. So violence emerges here as the principal reason that God is disappointed in humanity, right? It's not hard to open up the newspaper today and say, oh, you know, this is still a thing. But this is, you know, what God is pointing to is, this is why I'm going to destroy humanity. Again, I think it raises a good question. Violent humanity, God's like, well, I'm going to enact divine violence and wipe them all out to try to undo their violence. It raises a question, this sense for me at least, can violence undo violence? Does violence correct violence?
You went back and you said it was around 600 BC that this was put together. People in that time and place had no concept of the entire span of the universe, or the timeline of the universe. This killing off and rebirth and regeneration had happened hundreds of times before that. The humans at the time had no concept of it. But to me, that speaks to the greatness of God, that in a time and a place with no historical pretext, no science for all intents and purposes, very primitive, they did think this was a one and only event. But we've now come to know, and that's what makes our study of theology so deep, I think, is we've now come to know this was not the first, and it will not certainly be the last.
Yeah, so this is sort of an extinction event, right? And it does point to this sort of like ongoing, God creates world, God undoes creation, and then we'll see in the story God redoes creation. So it's very much a creation, uncreation, and recreation, this sort of cycle that continues. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Stuart.
The text gives the rationale for destroying mankind as moral. Humankind had become immoral in the eyes of God, but the text doesn't tell us why God had to kill all the animals. There would be no moral component to the behavior of the animals. Why kill all the animals?
That's a really,
The animals on the earth?
they sort of become collateral damage in a
Exactly.
sense, yeah. Assuming that the cows aren't taking up swords against other cows, right? Yeah, that's a really good point, right?
But and I'm reading a dangerous book, and so I hesitate to mention it.
Many books are dangerous.
Yeah, but it comes at a time when mankind was moving from worshiping animals and trees
Oh, interesting.
into looking into a single God
Okay.
as they moved into an agrarian environment, and they depended on somebody to give them rain and to give them sunlight.
Yeah.
And so they were looking for somebody to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like, you know, this story is, and this is my version, not the author, but is that this story is intended, was intended, maybe the one in Mesopotamia even before it, but that it was time to move on from worshiping gods of animals in Egypt and whatever, into a monotheistic God who was in control of everything.
One creator of the universe.
Yeah.
Yeah, certainly that was a big concern for early Jewish people. Yeah, worship of God alone.
Title of a book?
I'll tell you another thing, if you want to inject a
Homo
little political aspects to this,
Deus.
use this as an argument in favor of capital punishment.
That's interesting. I don't know if we're going to read it today, but
That's what God did.
Chapter 9, verse 6, whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human shall that person's blood be shed. For in his image God made humankind. God is going to be, we're gonna have to wait and see if this fixes the problem. Does God's violence correct humanity? I'm thinking of this perspective as a parent now. You know, how do you correct your children when they misbehave? Sometimes you just have to let it happen. You have to pick your battles. Let's see. I did give you the dimensions of the ark. It is rather big, right? About a football field and a half long, 73 feet wide and 44 feet tall, I guess. So it is a big boat. Certainly people have attempted to recreate this recently in, I think, Kentucky or so. Yeah. Let's keep reading a little bit. These are great questions and comments. We're finding some good stuff here. Let's read the first 10 verses of chapter 7. We're going to hit a little bit of a hiccup, I think. Notice the name change here, whoever's reading. Then the Lord said to Noah. So we see it was God in verse 22. Now chapter 7 starts with the Lord, so we see these sources are being interwoven, okay? Will someone read the first 10 verses of chapter 7 for us?
Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and its mate, and a pair of animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive on the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all that the Lord had commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of waters came on the earth. And Noah with his son and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came on the earth.
Awesome, thank you. What does 7 days make you think of in verse 10?
Creation.
Absolutely. So we have this hat tip in the narrative to creation. God is undoing creation, right? God made the earth in 7 days. Now God is basically undoing that creation, just as we sort of already alluded to. Anything stand out to you as particularly...
Clean and the unclean.
Yeah. All right. How many animals did Noah take on the ark? We already established this, right? 2 by 2. Here we have 7 pairs of all clean animals. There seems to be a little bit of discrepancy, right? When I think back to childhood, I never remember anyone saying there were 7 of some animals, or 7 pairs of some animals, and just 1 pair of the other. This is a result of the 2 sources. One source just says 2 of each animal. One source says 7 pairs of clean animals, because that source will have Noah doing a sacrifice when he gets off the ark. If you sacrifice some animals when you get off the ark, you're going to make one species go extinct, right? So we have to add some extra clean animals in there so we can sacrifice them when we land. Make sense? But it is a little bit jarring, I think, the first time that you read this. All of a sudden you're like, wait, 7 pairs of animals? I thought it just said 2. This is the 2 sources being woven together, and the author, letting them speak for themselves. This is interesting bonus trivia. Who was the oldest person that Genesis mentions? Anybody remember?
Methuselah.
That's right, yeah, Methuselah. If you do the math, based on when Methuselah was born, how many years he lived, and when he died, Methuselah actually dies the year of the flood. Isn't that interesting? Now we have no idea whether he dies in the flood or he dies before the flood or whatever. If you go back and track these numbers, like literally Wright, 600 years plus 300 years, and Methuselah dies in the flood. That's bonus information. Will not be on the test. I was just always intrigued by that. Yes, ma'am.
A couple who's not here today and who shall remain nameless because they'll kill me, but they actually visited the Ark in northern Kentucky
Oh, okay.
a couple weeks ago. Now, that Ark has been built exactly according to by the people that run it. And apparently, they are the believers of Archbishop Usher's 4004 BC date of creation.
Mm-hmm.
So everything is geared to that very fundamentalist belief. And they've even given names to Noah's wife and to his 3 daughters-in-law.
Yeah.
My question to you is, why do you think that people today still accept the concept that dinosaurs were on the ark and that they lived at the same time as mankind, and the exact word for word belief that is in the Bible? And I'm just I've always
Yeah.
been curious why people today can deny and defy all scientific logic.
That's a really good question, and probably outside of the scope of what I can say right now. I will say I have a cartoon with a couple of dinosaurs on the top of a mountain surrounded by water, and this boat sailing off in the distance, and the dinosaurs look at each other and say, "Oh, that was today." For some people, this is a really big issue, and I get that. The people that built the Ark Museum in Kentucky have very different opinions about this story than I do. I was unfortunately trained by Presbyterians, so you're going to have to blame it on them for my perspective. But it is, yeah, it's a tricky question. I'm watching the clock, and I know we bit off way more than we could ever chew this morning by trying to do all of Noah's Ark. Can we maybe can I call attention to just a few key things? And this story is so long. So notice as we come up to the second half of chapter 11, the rain is going to start falling. Oh, and this is really good in verse 11. The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven are open. Water is coming from below and above. This is a two-way flood. It's not just rain, but in Hebrew cosmology, if you were here for my heaven and hell class, this image might be similar. In ancient Hebrew understanding, there is water below the earth and water above the earth. Water comes down and water comes up. So they're literally caught in this great deluge. All right? And notice again, verse 13, it says they entered the ark. This is the second time they've entered the ark. This is another one of those places where we see this as two narratives being stitched together by the author. Okay.
So the timeline is he built the ark over how much time, and then he had 7 days by God, and then, I'm just trying to get the timeline.
It's a little bit tricky to follow for me because these two narratives are stitched together. And then there's 40 days and 150 days. You almost have to read through and write everything out. I didn't do that before now, but it might be worth your time to report back.
Yeah, bring it next week.
Yeah, that's right. So let me call your attention to this. Let's see. Verses 21 to 23 in chapter 7. And all flesh died that moved on the earth, birds, domestic animals, wild animals, and so forth. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. God blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and birds. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark. Did you get the picture? Literally everything died. It says that over and over again. It's emphatic. This, again, is sort of like an extinction level event in Genesis.
Except for the fish and everything that lived in the sea, and
Yeah, it
sort of
doesn't-
lives credence to the fact that maybe mankind came out of the sea.
Oh, interesting.
Good point.
Yeah, well, certainly they're saved through the water. Let's see. I know I'm trying to see what we can cover with the time that we have left. The very beginning of chapter 8, rain has fallen. Chapter 8, verses 1. God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and domestic animals, and God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. This certainly harkens back to Genesis 1, where God's wind or God's spirit moves over the surface of the waters. God has undone creation, and now God is redoing creation with God's breath or wind moving over the waters. And then look at this in verse 17. We get a raven, we get a dove in the middle of this chapter. They come out of the ark. And then verse 17, God says, be fruitful and multiply on the earth. Who else did God say, be fruitful and multiply to? Adam and Eve, that's right. Again, we have this creation, uncreation, recreation. This is, in some senses, the Adam and Eve story all over again, I would suggest. Let's see. God, verse 20 in chapter 8, Noah built an altar and then took of every clean animal and every clean bird. Thank goodness we brought the extras, and makes a sacrifice. And then I think this is really crucial. Verse 21, and the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind. For the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth, nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. Remember we read this earlier, chapter 6, verse 5. Every inclination of their hearts was only evil continually. Do you see the parallelism here? Who changed as a result of the flood? Humanity sure didn't, all right? Humanity was violent before the flood. Humanity is violent after the flood. Who changes?
God.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And I think that may speak, I can't remember your precise question. Yeah, your comment earlier about how we wrestle with God's omniscience. Genesis suggests that God changes fundamentally as a result. God is reflecting, what type of God am I going to be in relation to these humans? And God says, I'm not going to do this again. They're still evil, and in many cases maybe evil to the core, but I am not going to enact this sort of divine violence upon them again. All right? So we do see chapter 9, verses 11 to 13. I will establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood. This is the sign of the covenant. I have set my bow in the clouds, a rainbow. If you think about a rainbow, it looks like an archer's bow. God's hanging up God's bow. This is a weapon of war, right? God is not going to use this sort of violence on humanity again. It points upward so that arrow's not shooting downward at humanity. God's hanging up God's bow in the clouds and will not use it on humans again. All right? Let me pause there. I know we kind of blurred through some of that, but if there are a couple more comments or questions or...
Another question. At least I've always been taught that the reason we're the way we are is that God gave us free will and gave us the ability to think for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I forgot what I was gonna say.
That's
It's
okay.
gone.
Yeah.
Senior moment.
But it does, it sort of raises this
Oh,
question.
I know what I was gonna ask you. Where in the Bible does it say God gave mankind free will?
Oh, that's a great question. Where does it say in the Bible that God gave humans free will? Well, y'all are Presbyterians, right?
I know, that's what
I'm almost positive it never uses the phrase free will.
But a choice is given.
Choice, yeah.
So we can call it free will.
Yeah, I
But
think, yeah.
that gives us a choice for choosing,
For what?
for choosing good or evil.
Yeah.
We have a choice.
Yeah, and I think for most of us, the reality is that we choose both at different times, right? All of us choose violence at times, whether literal violence or otherwise, and sometimes we make the right choices. Yeah, it does raise hard questions. Why did God create humanity this way? Do we believe God created humanity this way?
But it also establishes the precedent that God can establish the covenant with us, even though we fail, and it says that he'll never do it again, but it doesn't mean he won't establish new covenant. So it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the Jewish history.
That's right. This is the first covenant that God makes with people in Genesis, or in all of the Bible. And it is sort of unilateral. God says, I'm going to make this covenant with you. I'm not going to do this again.
Can I tell a quick story about Joan Trotty? Joan Trotty used to have a wonderful Noah's Ark sweater that she wore all the time. And she told me one time that the reason you see Noah's Ark toys in antique shops, little wooden sets of Noah's Ark, is because during the time when religious observances were really strict, the Noah's Ark toy was the only toy children were allowed to play with on Sundays.
Interesting.
I thought that was interesting.
I have sort of thought, like, in retrospect, after reading through this, why in the world is this a children's story?
Right.
When God basically commits, genocide or I don't know what you want to call it, but I think it's the animals,
They love the
right?
animals.
They're really cute, and that makes this a children's story. Yeah, and I'm sorry that I have to wrap up and go. I actually have to go into the waters this morning myself. There's a baptism at my church, and they asked me if I would come stand with them in the water. Very different aquatic experience, thankfully. I'm really grateful for you guys. I hope that y'all have a great time with Mark Biddle next week. If you email me, I'd be glad to take more questions via email, and I think we'll be back in March. And we're going to talk about one of those other great stories that you guys mentioned, too. So thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you.